Hello and welcome. Today I want to share something that feels deeply psychological, deeply spiritual, and deeply human. It comes from a short Hebrew phrase that has been living in my heart. Oy la'ani Shvi. It can mean woe to the poor one within me, but it can also evoke the captive one within me. And that double meaning matters, because this phrase speaks not only to personal trauma, but also to collective pain, not only to the wounded individual soul, but to the wounded communal soul, not only to inner captivity, but to the lived experience of exile, rupture, and suffering that peoples, and especially the Jewish people, have carried across generations, including in our own time. I want to explore this carefully, respectfully, and with depth. From a clinical perspective, trauma often feels exactly like captivity. People describe feeling trapped inside themselves, frozen in fear, unable to move freely emotionally, disconnected from their bodies, held hostage by shame or memories, cut off from their natural vitality. This is not a metaphor, it is very neurological. Trauma overwhelms the nervous system, and when that system is flooded with threats, it shifts into survival states like fight, flight, freeze, collapse, dissociation. These are not a weakness, they are a biological survival response. But psychologically, people often interpret these states as some kind of personal failure, like why can't I just move on, or why am I like this, or what's wrong with me? This is where compassion must begin. Because trauma does not reflect a weakness of any kind of character. It reflects a nervous system that has endured too much, too fast, and maybe even alone. When we say, Oy la'ani Shvi, we are not condemning ourselves. We are saying, there is a part of me that has suffered. There is a part of me that has been bound by experience, and I am finally willing to see it. That awareness is not pathology. That is the beginning of healing. Modern trauma psychology understands that the self is not one simple voice. We are made of parts. There might be the functioning self, the wounded child part, protector parts, fearful parts, ashamed parts, resilient parts. This aligns deeply with Torah language. King David speaks to his own soul. Why are you downcast, my soul? He is in relationship with his inner world. Healing happens when the adult, grounded self begins to relate compassionately to the wounded parts instead of silencing them. Oy la'ani Shvi is not despair. It is the observing self recognizing the wounded self with tenderness. There are times when trauma is not only personal. There are times when it is collective, when suffering is carried by families, by communities, by peoples. The Jewish people know collective trauma intimately. Exile, persecution, rupture, captivity, loss. And in our own time, we have witnessed again the unbearable pain of human beings being taken captive. Jews and others, innocent people whose lives were shattered. And I want to speak about this with reverence for the human soul, not from abstraction, but from lived experience. What I'm speaking about here is not ideology, but humanity, not argument, but suffering, not theory, but the real pain, endurance, faith, and dignity of human beings. From both a psychological and spiritual perspective, what matters here is the sacredness of life, the depth of what the soul can carry, and the resilience that can exist even in the aftermath of severe trauma. Clinically, this kind of resilience reflects extraordinary internal integration. Spiritually, it reflects the irreducible dignity of the soul. Resilience does not mean an absence of pain. Resilience means the presence of meaning alongside pain. Trauma strips away the illusion of control. People are left feeling vulnerable, exposed, uncertain, dependent, and emotionally raw. And many people experience this as shame. They believe vulnerability means failure. But psychologically, vulnerability is not pathology. Vulnerability is one of the most honest emotional states a human being can inhabit. It is the place where your defenses are softened and where truth can become possible, where healing can begin. Only when we understand this can we understand the mystical idea of dalut. Dalut is often translated as poverty or lowliness, but that translation is probably really incomplete. Dalut does not mean worthlessness. It does not mean collapse. It does not mean being diminished. Dalut describes the state of being undefended. The moment when someone can admit, I don't have control over everything, I am wounded, I am vulnerable, I need care. From a clinical perspective, this is exactly the moment therapy begins to work, because healing does not happen when people are defended. Healing happens when people are emotionally available to themselves. Mystically, dalut is not collapse. It is a threshold. It is the doorway where the false self dissolves and the authentic self begins to emerge, where compassion becomes possible, where truth replaces any kind of performance. The Zohar teaches something more precise and more demanding than the idea that light simply enters through our brokenness. It teaches that in the beginning, the divine light was too intense for our vessels to hold, and these vessels they shattered. The Shavirat HaKelim, and in that shattering, holy sparks became scattered into places of concealment, darkness, confusion, and brokenness. Our spiritual task is not merely to receive light. Our task is to go searching for these sparks. This is a deeper work of healing. When we engage in acts of goodness, when we choose compassion over cruelty, when we tend to our wounds instead of denying them, when we help another human being feel less alone, when we repair something that has been damaged, we are doing more than psychological healing. We are elevating these sparks. We are revealing the goodness inside that is hidden inside, places that appear dark. We are uncovering light that has been trapped within pain, within confusion, within suffering. This means something profound. Sometimes souls are brought into very dark places, not because they are weak, but because they are so strong, because they carry the capacity to reveal holiness in places where it is hardest to find, because their presence itself becomes an act of spiritual repair. Healing then is not only personal, it is sacred, sacred work. Each act of compassion reveals a spark. Each act of truth restores light. Each moment of presence redeems something that was hidden. We are not simply letting light in, we are uncovering the light that has been buried. The Torah tells us clearly that Pharaoh hardened his heart. This is not only a historical story or a religious story, it is a psychological one. When confronted with suffering, human beings often respond in one of two ways. The heart hardens, numbness, denial, defensiveness, disconnection. Or the heart can soften and have compassion, feel grief and empathy and presence. Hardening the heart is a psychological defense. It protects against unbearable feeling, but it also blocks connection, empathy, and healing. The work, individually and collectively, is to resist becoming emotionally closed, to remain tender without being destroyed, to remain open without losing stability. That is not weakness, that is profound psychological strength. And I have seen this within these captives that have been freed, in all of them. When I watch them on videos, I see it. There's something important to name honestly. Healing does not always begin gently. Sometimes people are forced into healing by life through loss, through trauma, through crisis, through pain they did not choose. And that does not mean they failed. Sometimes suffering pushes us into the journey. Sometimes pain forces us to confront what we would otherwise avoid. And from that difficult entry point, with time, support, and compassion, the process can move toward more presence, more truth, more gentleness, more integration and meaning. Being forced into the journey does not invalidate it. It makes the journey real. Healing is not erasing suffering. It is not deleting your memories. It is not pretending things were fine. Healing is a relationship between the self and the wounded parts, between the nervous system and safety, between pain and compassion, between soul and meaning. When someone can say, I see the wounded part within me, and I am staying with it, that is the beginning of being liberated. Oila ani shabi'i becomes presence, witnessing, commitment not to abandon the self ever again. That is where the journey home begins. not only home to safety, but home to self, home to dignity, and home to the soul. If you are listening and recognizing something here, the frozen parts, the wounded parts, the tender parts, please hear this. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not defective. You are not a failure, but healing can sometimes be slow. You are a nervous system that adapted to survive. You are a soul that endured and will endure, and you are a human being still seeking meaning, and that seeking itself is life. Healing begins with honesty, with your presence, with compassion, and with the willingness not to abandon the things that hurt. And often, very quietly, from that place, the journey home will begin.